Now it's time, biology students, for us to overview the plant kingdom. Let's get started. Woo! So when we talk about the plant kingdom, we have to remember that we're talking about eukaryotic cells, meaning they have a nucleus. Even more so that we know that their cells are slightly different because they have a cell wall, and that cell wall is made up of the carbohydrate cellulose, which is a polysaccharide. It is multicellular. They're autotrophs. We know that because they do photosynthesis. All right? Almost all plants are considered terrestrial, meaning they live on soil. They have a waxy covering called a cuticle that helps them reduce water loss. And they evolved from green algae, which are single-celled protists that were also able to do photosynthesis. We know that there's tons of different categories of these types of plants, and we'll learn about them in more detail. We know that the plants have a couple major parts that we're going to be digging into today, and those are roots, stems, and leaves. Okay, let us jump in. Let's start with roots. So when we think about roots, we have to remember that roots are really for anchoring. They're also for absorbing water and minerals. We have a lot of minerals here: nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and magnesium. They're also going to store a little bit of extra food that's produced by photosynthesis, but not a ton. It depends on which type of organism we're talking about and how it uses its roots. All right, some examples of ones that really use their roots for storage are the types that actually eat the roots. So carrots, radishes, parsnips, sweet potatoes, and beets, those things that we're actually eating are big food storages of roots. Pretty cool, right? So this big thing kind of looks like a big giant carrot, right? And that's what we eat for those different things. We're eating the food stored in the roots. Pretty crazy. Stems are really all about support and transport. All right, stems are really how water goes between the roots to the leaves. They're also going to help produce the leaves and branches and flowers depending on the type of plant. Some of these stems are edible for us as humans. So potatoes, right, are underground stems, all right, that are very high in the polysaccharide starch or carbohydrate starch. Sugarcane is a storage of sugar in stems. Celery and rhubarb are also stems that we eat as humans, all right. But really, when we think about the stem, we actually want to think about what is like their veins and arteries, the transport system inside the stem. So now we're zooming inside the stem. And there's two major types of these vascular or transportation systems. The first one's called xylem. Xylem is in charge of carrying water. It moves water up using capillary action, which we know is all about hydrogen bonding and water polarity, pulling up thin tubes. We already learned about that. And the other type is phloem over here, and that type on top of what's already happening, this is another transport system in the stem, and it's carrying food and sugars from the leaves to other parts like the roots. Why is it going in that opposite direction? Well, because the leaves are up here and the roots are down there, and photosynthesis is happening more at the top of the plant making sugar. When water is being gotten at the bottom of the plant, it needs to move up. So it's pretty cool. There's these two different highway systems going in almost opposite directions. Very cool. So we can see these sometimes in tree rings. You do not need to draw this, but it's pretty neat. The xylem is this section that we really would count rings for, and the phloem is kind of more at the outside. This is why it's really important to be careful to treat the outer part of the tree carefully, because there's transportation systems, and if we accidentally harm them, it might harm the whole tree or the plant. And each layer of the xylem, or the water transportation system, is what we count for the tree's age. Pretty neat. All right, leaves, the site of photosynthesis. We already learned this a little bit, but we know that there's this waxy cuticle that prevents water loss from the plant. We know that epidermis is the upper part or bottom part, and it is kind of like the skin layer. Our epidermis is our skin, and it has tiny holes that are called stomata. The stomata are those tiny holes pictured here that allow gas exchange. We know that photosynthesis and cellulation are happening, and we know that CO2 needs to come in for photosynthesis, oxygen's coming out, a little CO2 comes out for cellular respiration. The cells around the stoma are called guard cells. Okay, they're really neat. They control the opening and closing. We know the layers in between all of this are called mesophyll. That's where photosynthesis actually happens. And then within this, there is some slight xylem and phloem, those bundling of those vascular tissues we saw also in the stems of the leaf. They also make their way into the leaves themselves. And we can see that as the veins inside the actual leaf. Pretty neat. All right, let's learn a little bit more about stomata. All right, just to get some specifics, this is the actual opening. This is when we're looking at it 1,000 times for normal magnification. Kind of looks like a crazy eyeball. And so the guard cells are these outer two cells here, and they open and close based on how much water they have. And you'll learn more about the details of that when you get into IB biology. Leaves have really cool adaptations. Okay, some leaves just keep their stomata open to allow gas exchange all the time, but some have these really good systems to prevent water loss by closing the stomata at certain times. Right? This is especially important in dry areas and hot and sunny areas where evaporation and transpiration can happen too much. Transpiration is the evaporation out of leaves. So we want to prevent too much water loss by closing those floodgates or those guard cells around the stomata. So our example here is a cactus. Those leaves are actually thorns, right? And so they don't actually do photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is only going to be carried out by this big stem area, which is pretty neat. Those thorns are also there for defense, which is another cool adaptation. And they also have this neat way of closing their stomata for water loss. Wonderful job, guys.